From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana.
Üzülerek söylüyorum. Milletimizin
In a large closet lined with smart business suits and blue shirts, a middle-aged man with glasses fixes his tie whilst being filmed.
emniyet güçlerini bu kötülüğe alet ederek evin 16 milyon İstanbullunun konutunun kapısına
We are faced with great tyranny, he tells the camera. But I want you to know that I will not give up. This man is Ekrem Imamoglu, the mayor of Istanbul. He's being filmed on the day when he was set to be named as a presidential candidate, but instead, he's now getting ready to be arrested. The police are outside. They're about to raid his home and hold him on corruption and terrorism charges. But Imamoglu has a huge following. He's seen as the greatest threat to President Erdogan's 2-decade-long grip on power. Within hours of the arrest, protests erupted in Istanbul. And they grew, spreading across the country. Hundreds of thousands of demonstrators have taken to the streets, clashing with riot police firing rubber bullets and tear gas. More than 1,000 of them have been arrested. But Erdogan has shown no sign of backing down, instead branding the protests as evil. The crackdown on political rivals has brought back memories of Erdogan's own spell in prison when he was the mayor of Istanbul and the challenger for the presidency. But in this modern era of strong men, from Trump to Putin, who will stand up for democracy? The story today: turmoil in Turkey, the people versus Erdogan.
My name is Andrew Finkel. I'm a journalist. I've been living and working in Turkey for quite a long time. I first came here as a journalist in 1989, but I first came here as a kid in 1967.
Wow.
You were much younger then, I suspect. And the way I explain it, I was on the junior varsity basketball team with Orhan Pamuk, in 1967. So he was a better novelist than he was a basketball player, I have to say. But maybe I am too, I don't know.
So you've clearly come across all the great Turkish legends in your time, and you've been living there now for decades.
For decades, yes. I mean, I spend more time in London now, but I have lived here for a very long time.
And Andrew, from where you are in Istanbul, just give us a sense of what you've seen in the last few days and what the protests have been like and what you're hearing from friends.
Well, the protests have been fairly localized. People have been going to the municipality, which is in the center of the old city, and they've been going at night. This is the month of Ramadan, and people go home early, and so rush hour is like an hour or two earlier than it normally is. And I was going home on Wednesday, the day that Imamoglu was arrested. Going up the metro escalator, there was a crowd. Everyone was shouting in unison slogans in his defense. You can imagine, going home on the Piccadilly line and people are protesting the day's events. So it was really quite dramatic. So instead of going home to break the fast, they've been going to the municipality. And why are they going there? I think there's clearly a sense of outrage and injustice, which is driving people on.
And as somebody who lives in Istanbul, tell us a bit about the mayor. Tell us about Ekrem Imamoglu and the sort of character he is.
Well, he's a great public speaker. He knows how to address a crowd. I mean, the key thing about him, I think, is that his party, the CHP, the Republican People's Party, had a reputation for being against pious religious people and was very pro-secular. But his name actually means son of an imam, Imamoglu. And he's managed to, I think, alleviate the fears of his constituents that he somehow represents a threat to their beliefs and tenets or way of life. And he has a knack of, getting along with people. I mean, not everyone thinks he's the Messiah, but what you hear quite often and from quite a lot of people is, why am I protesting? It's not just in favor of Ekrem Imamoglu. I'm here to defend democracy. So I think people realize it's not just the mayor's liberty and freedom and ability to fulfill a role he was elected to, which is at stake, but it's the whole future of Turkish society, which is at a watershed.
His predecessor was Erdogan himself. He was, at one point, mayor of Istanbul. It's a very powerful position in Turkey. And yet, it often feels like Istanbul isn't necessarily representative of the rest of the country. How well does Imamoglu go down across Turkey?
Well, he's from the Black Sea, which is where Tayyip Erdogan is also from. And if you say Istanbul's not typical of Turkey, well, it is actually. It's a microcosm of Turkey. There's no one from any part of Turkey that doesn't have a neighborhood or an association representing their part of the world. So Istanbul is very much a picture of the rest of the country. And one often hears the prejudice that Tayyip Erdogan's party, the Justice and Development Party, represents the countryside, the CHP represents the cities and the coast. Well, that's not exactly the case, because Tayyip Erdogan was very, very powerful in Istanbul. He regards it as his base. He was born here. This is where all the wealth is, where GDP is generated, where contracts are given out, where things happen. And the famous slogan is, "He who controls Istanbul controls Turkey." And that's pretty much what's at stake here.
When Imamoglu became the mayor of Istanbul, it was seen as a great political upset. He beat Erdogan's candidate for the job. Just explain what's been happening in the last few days, why he's suddenly at the heart of another big political upset.
So he was elected in 2019 by a fairly narrow majority. And the result wasn't recognized, and the higher election board, as it's called, actually annulled the results of that election, and they said it was too close to call. So they reset the election in 2019, and people were so incensed that he got a really handsome majority when it was fought again. And so this was really very humiliating and embarrassing for the governing party. So he's been the mayor for the last 4 years. Now the mayorship really has an advantage, because the government has been running macroeconomic policy in Turkey. That makes all the big decisions that affect people's life and livelihood, and they've been making the wrong decisions. A year ago, inflation in Turkey was running at 75%. So in order to get that under control, there's been a sort of an austerity program. And if the government is taking responsibility for this economic mess, the municipality is the organization that alleviates the mess, that provides people with free meals, creches for children, centers for culture. So the mayor is in a really good position to increase his support. And the government seems to have been really genuinely afraid that in a presidential contest, the government would suffer. And so that's the background to what we've been seeing this week.
And so they've seemed to have taken action. Just talk us through what's happened, starting, I suppose, with a university, which you wouldn't expect to be an instrument necessarily of government policy, but something is afoot.
Well, this is quite bizarre. I mean, the technical requirements to be a candidate for president in Turkey are that you have to be a university graduate. And Imamoglu almost certainly has a degree. The curious thing is that many people doubt that Tayyip Erdogan has a proper degree, and there's been a great deal of suspicion that no one knows who his classmates were. For example, he doesn't seem
Really?
he seems to have gone through university without meeting anyone. So many people think this is the pot calling the kettle uneducated. But the situation is that Imamoglu went to a university in Cyprus and had his credits transferred to Istanbul University. And suddenly, 31 years later, Istanbul University says, no, this wasn't valid. He doesn't have a degree. He can't stand as president. And of course, no one really believes that 3 decades later, they scratched their heads and realized they'd made a mistake. It was obviously under some sort of pressure.
As you say, 31 years later, to be questioning whether he really deserved his diploma certainly seems like a political move. And that was sort of confirmed a couple of days later when the law got involved. Just tell us about that.
Basically, Imamoglu had suffered all sorts of legal proceedings. For example, when the 2019 mayoral contest was annulled, his office issued a press statement saying that this was the work of idiots to annul the decision. And this was deemed as being insulting to an institution of the Turkish state. So a criminal case was taken against him, which he was convicted of and which he's appealing. And if that conviction stands, then he may not be eligible to be president. The government has also been pursuing other cases against him of corruption, bid rigging, all those sorts of things, which one has to say Mr. Erdogan was suspected of having done himself when he was mayor. So he's accused of embezzlement and all sorts of things. And there's another case against him which says that he was a member of a terrorist organization or that he supported terrorism.
Tell us about that.
Well, it's hard to tell you because I'm not quite sure on what basis it's been made. It's been made on the basis of anonymous tips, hidden informers' reports. But the essential thing is that in order to become elected the mayor of Istanbul in 2019, he did a deal with the pro-Kurdish parties. And so this was regarded as somehow he played into the hands of a Kurdish terrorist organization.
Where does that stand at the moment? I mean, he's been arrested.
Well, he's been charged and taken into custody and sent to jail.
While he's mayor?
Well, the assumption is that he'll be removed from that post. Central government has the authority to remove the mayor and appointing what they call trustees, unelected officials, to run the city in their stead. So the municipality in Istanbul is sort of a building under siege. It's become the sort of headquarters of this rebel movement.
It's fascinating. So the mayor is behind bars. The municipality, people in Istanbul are fighting back. There are protests. They're very resistant to having trustees, replacement mayors brought in his stead. There's obviously a big legal case going on. We don't know how all of this will play out. As things stand, though, would he still be able to stand in an election if he wanted to stand as president against Erdogan?
Well, this is an interesting point. On Sunday, even as Imamoglu was being sent off to prison in vehicles in a notorious prison outside Istanbul, there was a vote going on, and this was sort of an impromptu ballot organized by his party. So you had nearly 15 million people on Sunday voting in favor of Ekrem Imamoglu as the presidential candidate through all over the country.
That's extraordinary.
This was an impromptu vote, and pretty much it comes to about 35% of the electorate voted in favor of Ekrem Imamoglu, which is more than any other candidate, including Tayyip Erdogan, would have received in such a vote. So, although he's clearly the candidate who people want, the government may find means of stopping him.
Andrew, while Imamoglu seems to be the great opposition figure to Erdogan, the man who could unseat the president. There are also huge similarities between the two. You mentioned earlier that they've both been mayor of Istanbul. The arc of their rise to power also seems to be quite similar. Take us back to the 90s. You've watched the rise of Erdogan. You were the first foreign journalist to interview him. When you first came across him, what was he like?
Well, he was pretty stern, I have to say. He wasn't particularly friendly. He wasn't really used to dealing with foreign journalists. I mean, he was a local boy, the head of the party in Istanbul, someone who, hard scrabble. He'd sold, the equivalent of pretzels on the streets of Istanbul. He was not someone who was incredibly sophisticated, and he regarded us with great suspicion, and it was really quite an uncomfortable interview. The obvious question to ask him was whether his party, which was a pro-Islamic party, was going to infringe upon the liberties of the secular population of Istanbul, and which he replied to by saying, well, look at London, you can't read the call to prayer from the mosque in Regent's Park, which had me scratching my head. I wasn't sure whether you could or not. It wasn't the most comfortable interview I've ever had, but I came across him various times over the years subsequently, and on each encounter, he became more charming. He's more comfortable, more sure of himself. I mean, I met him once 15 years after I first interviewed him, and he remembered the neighborhood where I lived. It was quite extraordinary. Wow. And you said there is a parallel between the two. I mean, the thing about Tayyip Erdogan was that he was actually put in jail for 4 months. He was charged with the heinous crime of reciting a poem, which was a nationalist poem, which was interpreted as inciting religious hatred. And it was clearly a political ploy to get him off the scene and to imprison him just long enough so that he would be disqualified from political office. So what had happened to him, he's obviously trying to do to somebody else. But when I went to see him after he'd been released from prison, he was wearing this rather snazzy blazer and was so sort of amicable and charming. I was quite flabbergasted.
He somehow came out of prison more charming, a more likely president, a better politician. He has been in power for an extraordinarily long period of time. Whatever you think of his policies, he will be remembered as one of the great leaders of Turkey just because it's been so long. Just give us a sense of what he's been like in the role. How is he viewed as a leader?
His initial success, when he came to office, the reason he came to office was not because he was leading our sort of Islamic religious revival in Turkish politics. It was because people had suffered this vast economic collapse of the Turkish economy in 2001. The currency collapsed, interest rates were in the zillions. People were on the streets because they didn't know where their next meal was coming from. And he came to office, and Turkey was already engaged in an IMF recovery program to get the economy back on track. It wasn't his government which devised it, but it was his government which implemented it. And they implemented it fairly successfully. I remember the cliche I wrote that Turkey was the only country that swallowed the IMF medicine and enjoyed the taste. So many people regard him as having restored both the nation's fortunes and its place in the world. But 20 years is a long time, and a lot of things have gone wrong since that period.
And Andrew, it's not just the economy that's changed under Erdogan. It went from stabilising and growing to now this point of real uncertainty. Similarly, his view almost of democracy seems to have changed. He came in effectively as a Muslim Democrat. Under his watch, though, there's been a real autocratic turn. Just talk us through how he's started to crack down on the media and on protests over the years.
I mean, you say he was an Islamic Democrat, which is, I remember using that expression in the Times once when I was, a nipper. And I got this very angry phone call from one of his close cabinet members saying, of course we're not an Islamic Democrat, we're Democrats. They rejected even that title. But it was very clear that, for example, he was a great advocate for the rights of pious. At one point, if you wore a headscarf, you couldn't go to a Turkish university.
And he reversed that.
He reversed that, and he said this wasn't a move in favor of Islam, this was a move in favor of democracy. He pursued this strategy as a democratic strategy. And, a lot of people who weren't Islamic supported this, and this was a thing that they too believed, that Turkey was becoming polarized for no particularly good reason. So he did sort of more than hint that were he not to be elected, if other people got control of the reins of power, that this ancien regime of discrimination against Islamic people would be reinstated. And of course, as I said earlier, Imamoglu's great virtue is that he doesn't pose that particular threat. He's very much avoided that trap. But there were various incidents. One of the most notorious, of course, was the occupation of a park in central Istanbul in 2013, Gezi Park.
Thousands gathered for a protest in the capital Ankara, a show of support for demonstrators in Istanbul and a stand against the government of Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan. For more than 2 weeks, protesters in Istanbul's Gezi Park defied Erdogan's warnings that they must vacate, but police evicted them on Saturday afternoon. What started as a campaign to stop Gezi being redeveloped mushroomed into mass anti-government protests.
This started out as an environmental protest, but it became a sort of fairly unfocused demonstration of a general discontent with the way Turkey was going, and that younger people weren't certain about their futures, and Turkey, which had been a candidate for the European Union and looked as though it were, going the way of Western democracies, was being excluded from that process. And the government was increasingly trying to rally support through core issues like abortion had never been an issue in Turkish politics. Suddenly it became an issue, or that people should have at least 5 children, and all sorts of dog whistles to a religious right in Turkey.
A moment of polarization and the protests.
Well, that's right. So that he wasn't afraid of this polarization. And in Gezi Park, I think people took the bait and said, no, that this is not right. And that protest was put down fairly harshly. And suddenly journalists began to lose their jobs in the state-affiliated news agencies. Suddenly there were mass dismissals. Newspapers started firing dissident people who weren't writing in favor of the government. Shortly after that, Erdogan's party and his supporters got into this tug of war with another Islamic group, the Gülenists, who tried to embarrass him by revealing all sorts of allegations of corruption and tape recordings. And in 2016, there was an attempted coup.
Chaos on Turkey's streets again, as police loyal to President Erdogan clashed with members of the military attempting a coup that left Turks unsure who was in charge of the country.
In my house, I could hear jets felt like they were flying through my bedroom. It was really quick.
Wow.
The windows were shattered from subsonic jets. People were killed. I could hear gunshots not far from where I am. But that coup was a strange alliance between the military and this Islamic group, the Gülenists. It was put down, and it was put down really through popular reaction. People came out and they said, we don't want a military coup. We want our elected leaders to rule us. We don't want people to overthrow the government. And so that was quite a moment in Turkish life, but it was used by the government to impose emergency rule and a whole set of draconian regulations, what they called rules by decree, so you didn't have to pass laws, you could just command laws.
So this moment that should have been a victory for democracy, fighting off a coup, actually ended up bringing about the end for an awful lot of democratic freedoms.
I think you managed to summarize it very well.
Andrew, if you're trying to understand Erdogan and his rule, a lot of people would point you towards his fascination with Turkish history, his obsession with the sultans and strongmen of the Ottoman Empire. Tell us a bit about that, how that shapes his worldview.
Well, maybe not the previous generation, but the generation before that saw themselves as breaking with the past in a sort of radical way, as part of a new world, part of a revolutionary new Turkey. So the old Ottoman Empire was stale and unprofitable. The Republic brought in reforms, gave women an equal place in public life, reformed the language, made Turkey into a modern European, not democratic, but progressive country. But of course, part of that ideology was that covered women couldn't go to university, that the people's ordinary beliefs were frowned upon. There was a sort of a backlash to that. And of course, not just Tayyip Erdogan, but people like him managed to harness that backlash into a political movement, into a popular movement. And so respect for the people became a sort of movement, what they call a neo-Ottomanism, a sense of reverence for the past, so that the past wasn't really as terrible as people had made it out to be, but that there were many good things that had happened in the late Ottoman Empire, and that these things should be preserved and brought forward into contemporary Turkish society.
Well, and part of his neo-Ottomanism is about reclaiming Turkey's place in the world. He has positioned the country to be vital in so many peace talks, whether it be during the wars in Afghanistan, for example, more recently with Syria, with Israel, Gaza. He's been one of the most vocal leaders from the Middle East. Similarly with the Ukraine war, where he's ended up being the only person who's managed to get the Russians and the Ukrainians to engage in actual peace talks in a way that was very different to the way Donald Trump is now approaching it. Tell us about how he's managed to reform the idea of Turkey on the global stage.
I mean, now people speak about transactional politics in international affairs. Well, Tayyip Erdogan probably invented transactional politics. He understood in a very visible way power relations between nations. He always regarded, Western commitment to democracy, Western chiding of Turkey for not following a human rights policy as being so much cant, that there was an underlying power struggle behind everything. So he may not love Vladimir Putin, but he understands him. And the two men probably respect each other in a bizarre way, in the same way that Trump probably doesn't love Tayyip Erdogan, but they understand each other and understand their methods and have some respect for strongman politics.
In a way, that seems to have helped him. As you say, he's very transactional. It has helped him hold on to power. So there have been, during this period of sort of a real crackdown on democratic rights, journalists being put behind bars, opposition leaders, Kurdish leaders being put behind bars, even when the European Court objected to it. Nobody's ever held him to account for it. He doesn't seem to be under a huge amount of pressure from other leaders.
Every now and then the European Parliament will say something, or the Council of Europe will say something, but, Turkey suffers no repercussions for having done this. But, on the other hand, the opportunity costs are still there. I mean, there may not be some sudden economic collapse of Turkey because of the way that the rioters are being pelted with water cannon and rubber bullets, but, is the tourism season this year going to be as glorious as people are expecting? And in terms of prestige, is a country where hundreds of thousands of people come out on the streets protesting the government, does that really increase your standing on the world stage?
And in terms of the costs, Erdogan has probably gone further now than ever before. This is the leader of the opposition, the man who could have unseated him as president, behind bars, protests on the streets of Istanbul. And yet it comes at a time with Donald Trump in the White House, an era that seems to be the age of the strong man. Democracy is sort of in retreat all over the place. Do you think anybody will hold him to account for what's happening now?
Well, the people who are holding him to account are my neighbors, are his own people. Yes, the outside world may not enjoy leverage, but it's a question of whether the 19-year-olds on the streets who nobody said would ever come out and protest, that they grew up under Erdogan, that they've known nothing else and couldn't imagine anything else. Well, maybe they are imagining something else.
But Andrew, you've lived in Istanbul for so long. You've lived through protests before. You mentioned the protests in Gezi Park, which had a huge crackdown and stopped people coming out and objecting loudly. You mentioned the attempted coup, which again led to, if anything, a more authoritarian turn in the country. What do you think will happen now? Do you think this will all be silenced? Will Erdogan get his way? Or could this be the moment, a bit like the Arab Spring, that actually leads to proper change?
Well, we know where the Arab Spring led to. Sadly, it didn't lead to the change that people had wanted it to. I guess what you're asking is, can the genie be stuffed back into the bottle? And
Yeah. Will the people you know, will your neighbours stand for it?
they've been grumbling for a long time. You don't get so many people out on the street because they suddenly woke up in the morning feeling unhappy. I think what's happened is that maybe young Turks, are saying we have to make our own country better rather than, look to the outside world for solutions.
If you're a betting man, where would you say this will end?
I always lose my bets, so I never bet. There was a time when I thought I could, predict what would happen in Turkey with total accuracy, but I'm older and wiser now. I don't make bets. But I don't think the genie can go completely back into the bottle, and I'm not even sure if the president thinks that. His own life has been one of, overcoming people trying to stop him, and whether he now feels he can stop his younger rival, I wonder.
That was Andrew Finkel, journalist and author of the novel The Adventure of the Second Wife, The Strange Case of Sherlock Holmes and the Ottoman Sultan. There's continuing coverage of all the latest from the protests in Turkey at thetimes.com and on Times Radio. The producers today were Edith Rousselot and Sam Chantarasak. The executive producer was Fiona Leach, and sound design and theme composition were by Mal Lassetto. Thanks for listening. See you tomorrow.